All right, we are beginning our Faith Ringgold project. This will take us 2 full art days to finish. So to start today, we are going to make this background where we are going to be flying. So as you are working on this project, I am going to be coming around and taking your picture of you flying. So we just talked about like what kind of poses we could use for that. On this blue paper, we're going to make a city at night. So our buildings, for the most part, should probably be squares and rectangles. And they can be skinny and short, or they can be a little bit wider and taller. We want all of our buildings to be touching the bottom of the paper, so it doesn't look like any of them are floating. So I've just cut out several squares and rectangles, and I'm going to kind of arrange them into a composition. So that's just the arrangement of what I think looks good on my paper. You can have some come up and touch the top. I'm noticing that that has a little bit of some ripping at the bottom, so I'm going to trim that. You could have buildings coming behind another building. So you notice how I tucked that one back so it looks like this one is in front. You could have buildings that are a little bit shorter. And maybe this building is going to overlap that tall one a little bit, and then behind it I could still have more buildings. So layering is going to make it look like your project has some space, some depth, like you could actually fly in and out of these buildings. I could even add more in here. So it's okay if you see some spaces between your buildings, and it's okay if you have some behind them, like there is another street happening in your project. So I'm going to keep kind of arranging these, and when I come back I will have them all glued down so that they aren't going to move anymore. So there is not a set number of buildings that you need in this project, but the more that you have, the neater it looks for the spacing. Optional is that bridge, the George Washington Bridge. You do not have to have it in your project. I'm going to make mine look like it's in the background. So a bridge does float, so I can see I'm going to have part of the bottom here, and I can tell that it's really hard to see this on the video. So I would start in pencil if I were you. I'm going to use crayon so you can see what I'm doing right away. I see the bottom of the bridge in between these buildings. So it's kind of a horizontal line coming across. And the bridge needs to be supported. So I might see those towers coming up from behind the buildings. And it looks like there's a giant like smiley face that connects those towers. Those are just cables that we learned about in the story today, Tar Beach. So those cables are connecting the towers, and you would see tons of cables coming down as well. So I would start in pencil if you want to draw this bridge, just to make sure you got it correct. And then all I'm doing is I'm using a black crayon to make it look like a silhouette. That's a choice. Now you have yellow paint and white paint at your table spots. So I'm going to use the end of the paintbrush with the yellow, and I am going to stamp dots on some of my buildings. And that's just going to look like there's lights on at nighttime. So this is kind of looking like the banner that is in the hallway this school year of the silhouette of the city. So some of your buildings could be completely black. Some of these dots are bigger than others, and that's okay. Maybe the lights are brighter in those. So have fun with those dots. If you wanted some of them to be white, you could. Or you could save the white for the sky, and the white could be painted into a moon if you want a circle or if you want a crescent. You could also use the white, and I'm going to use this back end again for kind of stars in the sky. So I would say stars kind of have a whiter look to them. Again, you could use the yellow. Might see some stars in between that bridge. When you are finished, this part's going to go in the drying rack, and we're going to save it for next week to actually make our quilt part and to cut that picture out of ourselves to get us flying in our city. So when you're finished, drying rack, and that is all for today. So every piece I was gluing on, I was flipping it over and putting the glue on the back just to make sure I didn't have glue oozing out in between all those shapes. So before I start to add patterns onto those papers to make them look like fabric or quilt pieces, I'm going to glue this background down because you can see that it does overlap on top of these shapes. And I probably don't have to add patterns on top of the whole shape because this paper is going to cover it up a little bit. So gluing on the back. At this point you should also have your picture of yourself that you're going to cut out really well. I don't have one for this example, but you can see on this paper I tried to cut as best as I could around my body. If I have some or you have a little bit of white space showing, that's okay. And don't try to cut out in between every finger. That'll be really hard. I would just round those shapes off. You can glue yourself overlapping a building. You could glue yourself kind of tucked behind one if you wanted to try to peel one up. And you could be sideways or you could be laying flat. Really, it does not matter where you are putting your picture of yourself. The markers, the skinny markers, are to add patterns on top of your shapes. So this is kind of the part of the project where kids get lazy and they don't really want to do this part. This is what's going to make your project really look like a Faith Ringgold story quilt. If you can take your time and have every paper look different with a different pattern. So polka dots, stripes, zigzags, plus signs, plaid, dots, moons, stars, hearts, you name it. You could fill those papers up with different patterns. I have seen kids go crazy on this part and just get lazy and make their project look not as great as it could have. So be creative, be inventive. Every swatch or every fabric should look different. Maybe some of them you leave. If you've used painted papers, maybe one looks like that. Maybe you add a pattern on top of one of the painted papers. You get to be the quilter and the designer. Last finishing touch on this project is to find a black marker and to add tiny little lines to make it look like this quilt was stitched together. So I'm adding these lines between all those shapes. Kind of looks like thread that stitched it together. Adds a pretty cool effect. So at this point when you're finished, every square looks different. Your black lines are there and stitched, and you have your picture of yourself on there. At that time, I got paint on that story, you can begin your story. The if I could fly, I would fly too, and you get to make up the rest. So mine says I would fly to Paris, France. I would fly over the Louvre Art Museum, and it would be mine forever. I could walk through the museum and look at all the artwork. I would make sure to keep the Mona Lisa safe for everyone to see. If I could fly, I would have a house in France and a house in Monroe, and that would be amazing. And I signed my name. Your story might not be as long as mine, but you need to have a nice story about where you would want to fly to. It can be pretend, it can be real, but it should not be someplace close that we could drive to. When you're finished, these are going to go in the drying rack or on Mrs. Cleary's table. She'll let you know.